You're listening to Pause It For Me. This is Hannah.
This is Andrew.
And we are...
Pause it for me.
No, you're supposed to say professional badasses.
I wouldn't say that about myself.
Okay, what would you say?
Professional.
Beautiful woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And what am I?
Professional badass.
Okay, yeah.
That's what you said, right?
We're here for episode 10, and we watched, as we said we would, promise kept, El Mariachi and Light and Magic. They were pretty good.
Pretty good, yes.
But we'll get to that. Just before that, I'd like to give a little behind-the-scenes info to our listeners out there, just to give you an idea of how far in advance we've been recording these episodes so far. This is episode 10, and as of click now, I just posted episode 7. So we're like 3 episodes ahead. I'm sure at some point we'll get busier and we'll be scrambling to record the episode the day before. But as of right now, literally just posted episode 7. And now we're on episode 10.
How exciting.
It's exciting for me. Is it exciting for you?
It is.
Speaking of exciting, we just finished watching El Mariachi, directed by Robert Rodriguez, talked about in the book Rebel Without a Crew, a book that I read and you read. I gave it to you to read. It took you years to read, but you finally finished it, and then we watched the movie.
That's right. In college, I read The Disaster Artist, and Andrew recommended, since I like that, it's a book about making a film, that I should read Rebel Without a Crew. And then I read probably the lab rat part at the beginning, up to that, maybe some pre-production parts, and then just stopped reading it for 5 years.
Even though it's an awesome book.
Yeah. I kept on trying to reread it, but then I would reread the first couple pages and then not get past that.
Right. So the book chronicles the making of El Mariachi, Robert Rodriguez's first feature film, made very low budget. And according to one Internet Movie Database, El Mariachi is about a traveling mariachi is mistaken for a murderous criminal and must hide from a gang bent on killing him. We're going to jump right into Andy's Trivia Corner right after I pour myself a drink
right
here.
After this ad break.
First, a word from our sponsor. Zip Zop, the fusion of 2 flavors. And we're back. So, El Mariachi, Andy's Trivia Corner, number 1. The film initially cost $7,000 to make. Director Robert Rodriguez raised $3,000 of that $7,000 by volunteering to be a human laboratory rat. He was used to test a cholesterol-reducing drug. Paid $100 a day for 30 days, he wrote most of the script while locked in the lab. Peter Marquardt, did my best to pronounce that, was a fellow lab rat, but could not speak Spanish. He delivered his lines as the villain from a card held in his hand or out of the shot. Most of the $7,000 was spent on film for the camera. The version seen in most cinemas, and the one that we watched, has had approximately $1 million of post-production work and promotion behind it. So I think that one piece of trivia gives a pretty good catch-all for most of what happens in the book. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. So the beginning of the book is an introduction about how much he loves movies and filmmaking, and it talks about when he was a kid, he fell in love with camcorders and did a lot of short films and cut it together by himself in video. So then it really gives background to how he was able to make such a low budget film because he already had this childhood experience of it.
Right. So how would you say you enjoyed the book, and how did experiencing the book, which is the making of the movie, before even seeing the movie, how did that go for you?
Well, I could visualize a lot of elements in my head. And to me, it was something like it was more about the process than it was about the film itself. So to me, it was fine that I hadn't seen it.
Right. Because you did the same thing with Disaster Artist. You read Disaster Artist before ever seeing The Room.
Yeah, that's funny because I had listened to a podcast describing The Room, and I was like, this is amazing. I'm going to read the book because I was more interested in the process than actually seeing the movie, I guess.
Right.
Well, coming from a background as a child, making my own movies and, you know, figuring out how to edit video together and stuff like that.
I've seen the proof,
yeah. I feel like a kinship with him in that way is just wanting to make stuff and not knowing how to do it, you basically self-teach yourself everything. And that lends to some really interesting stuff, because if everyone is taught the same way, then they're going to make the same kind of movies.
Yeah.
And this is really his story to tell, because he knew Carlos, he knew the town that he had visited.
Carlos being the main actor, the star.
Yeah, the mariachi.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, he had sort of some resources to him, because he would call a friend of a friend and, you know, use someone's ranch and stuff. So it was like no one else could have told this story, because it was so specific to what he had on hand. And I love that. Yeah,
it was definitely a extremely inspirational book, especially like I think my brother got it for me for Christmas, and I read it in film school. So I obviously like came off reading that and was like going around to people like, "Oh, let's make something awesome. Let's just do it." Of course, we never like really ended up making anything cool or like outside of school in film school, but it was nice to dream for a while.
But that's the thing, is he was in film school and he's like, I want to do this, so I'm going to do it. And then they went down for a couple weeks and did it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what separates him from other people is, yes, he's very talented, but he just had the drive and determination to do it.
It was definitely all about just the initiative to do it. Because especially like watching the movie, what struck me was that it wasn't about how technically correct the shots were or how good the lighting was or whatever. It was more about the fact that it was an engagingly paced and edited and written movie.
I would agree with that.
You know? So it wasn't about like him being proficient with the camera necessarily. It was just a showcase for him being able to write and tell a compelling story. And that's why I found myself engaged with it.
I mean, there's definitely some talent there, filmmaking-wise. He's obviously, like, before he shot this, he had won film festivals for his short films and stuff. So it's not like he didn't have any skills, but, you know, part of making it any type of business is part talent and mostly just determination.
Yeah. It's definitely far from my favorite film of all time. I think, you know, I'm going to give my rating pretty early because it's the same as when I first watched it after I first read the book. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Mm-hmm. But I think it's definitely one of the best first films by a filmmaker. Because you look back and you think about a lot of directors' first films, and at least to me, when I think of a director's first film, it ends up not being their first film. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, I think of Christopher Nolan, right? I'm like, oh, first film, Memento. It's an amazing first feature film by a director. Pretty sure Memento's not actually his first film. I think it's like a second film, you know?
Well, it just goes to show, I mean, Robert Rodriguez never said that he liked every aspect of this film. He's like, I'm doing it cheap.
Yes.
And I expect no one to see this. I'm doing this solely for practice and to make a little bit of money so I can do it proper.
Yeah, his practice film. So that he could make mistakes and like no one would see the mistakes and he could learn from the mistakes and then do a better job the second time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But people liked it and they're like, you know what, let's release this. And he's like, I don't know. But he just, you know, he let it happen.
Right. Christopher Nolan, it seems like following 1 hour and 9 minutes would have been his actual feature film debut, which I have not seen. But like the Coen brothers, I think their first feature was Blood Simple.
Yeah.
I really didn't like Blood Simple. I thought it was pretty bad.
For a first film from indie people that have not a lot of money, like in the book, it talks about Robert screening the film for the first time for his wife.
Right. And
he's like, you know, tell me, be honest with me, how would you rate this? And she's like, basically like 7 out of 10. Right. But knowing how you made it and how tough it was to piece it together and like, you know, how low budget it was, is like 10 out of 10. Right.
Like, you know, you got to judge these kinds of films in two different ways. Like, how is it as a film? How is it as a first film? As a film, El Mariachi is like, pretty good. As a first film, it's excellent. Blood Simple, on the other hand, as a film, I thought it was pretty bad, and as a first film, I thought it was pretty bad. Like, it was, you know, it was fine.
To me, it was more like what Robert set out to do. Is more like a showcase of their talent.
Yeah.
to show, like, this is what we can do, and if you actually give us, like, a budget and stuff, we can make something cool, like Fargo.
Right. But it definitely shows the talent. Like, as a first film where he wasn't even trying to make something, 7 out of 10 is really excellent.
Amazing,
You know, Sam Raimi as well. I feel like most people think of his first film as Evil Dead, but it's not his first film.
Right.
IMDb says It's Murder, 1 hour 10 minutes. That would have been his first film.
Yeah, Bruce Campbell talked about that. I think it was like a comedy or something. It was screened at their college, and it did well locally.
Right.
But it was never, like, distributed as, like... If you think of it in that way, like, Evil Dead is his first commercially feature film that was distributed to lots of audiences.
Right. So all I was trying to get at was, I feel like most directors' first films end up being forgettable, but El Mariachi, I think, still stands the test of time of being, like, a really nicely put together film. Like, the only knock against it really is, like, some shots are really grainy. Particularly the first scene was, like, so grainy.
Yeah.
But there were other shots in the film that were, like, really beautifully lit and not grainy at all.
Definitely.
It looked excellent.
Well, knowing how it was shot, he did the best he could.
Right.
Because he basically had, like, 2 photo bulbs that, were daylight temperature that he screwed in to be practical bulbs on set. And he was mostly just using natural light. Or he was holding a reflector at the very edge of the camera in the close-up to bring in some light back.
Yeah. I'll do a little spoiler alert for Andy's Trivia Corner. There is basically no trivia for Industrial Light and Magic, or for Light and Magic, rather. So I beefed up the trivia section for El Mariachi. Speaking of which, trivia number 2. Most of the guns used in the film were water pistols. However, a few were real, borrowed from the town's police force. In a shot near the end of the film, just after the mariachi is pulled out of the yellow Ford van by Moko's henchmen, there's a shot of Moko walking towards the camera. Behind him, laying asleep on a bench, is the cop who is meant to be on set supervising the use of the weapons for that day. Well done, Mr. Copper. But the book was filled with lots of interesting trivia like that, so it was like, again, it was hard to narrow down the amount of trivia that I would read for this compared to Light and Magic, which had, like, none.
Right. Well, it's really a love letter to the town because they shot so many locations at that town and basically pulled in anyone that was willing to do it. Yeah. Like the kid with the basketball, he was just like...
chilling.
He was chilling on set and they're like, do you want to be in the movie? And they're like, okay.
Yeah. What did you think of the acting talent, considering most people had never acted before?
Most of them were good, except the bartender, which...
He was funny.
Yeah, he was funny. They mentioned in the book that he was nervous, which you can kind of see.
Yeah.
Most of the time, I didn't notice that all the dialogue was ADR.
I know, he did such a good job on that.
Yeah, I think what really helps is he knew that it was all going to be ADR, so he had them say their lines exactly how he thought it was going to be in the location, so the sound matches what you would think it would be for that vocal quality, instead of it not working and them going into a studio booth and then trying to remember how they said it on the day.
It's like you're reading right off of my trivia list. Getting ahead of me on that one. So having just finished the book a few weeks ago, what were some of your biggest takeaways from their filmmaking process?
I found it super fascinating how they shot it on film and then transfer it to video. Mm-hmm. Because now...
And when you say they, you mean he. Like singular person.
Yes, correct. You were right.
Yeah.
I mean, well, Carlos was a big help. Like, he was a producer, he was the star. But in terms of post-production, it was all Robert.
Right. Carlos was great, by the way. I thought he was a good leading man. He had those nice puppy dog eyes,
I was just rereading sections of the book, and they said that they had him dye his hair dark because his natural hair was too blonde.
Really? I can't even picture that.
Because he doesn't look as Mexican as the other guys.
Mm-hmm. Like Azul.
He's a lot more fair-skinned. Yeah. So I found it super fascinating, the whole process of him doing that. So he had it transferred onto video, and they had like a basic color correction over the whole film. And initially, I'm assuming in post-production, they redid the colors based on what I had heard. I think he was mad that the colors weren't how he liked it. He's like, this looked better on VHS.
Yeah.
And then he would had to go in and fix some stuff.
You can tell he was really married to that process.
Definitely. I mean, well, back then especially, and this will lead into Light and Magic, is the arduous film process of taking a film strip and then cutting it and then making another cut and everything. And George Lucas being like, if I wanted to hold like another frame on that take, I would have to go back in and physically like put the frame back on.
Yeah, you'd have to find the piece of film that you cut off. That might be on the floor, or it might be in a bin or something, and then like stick it back on.
Yeah, in the I Love Lucy DVDs, they'll show like deleted scenes that weren't like properly remastered. They're like, we found this on the cutting room floor.
Literally on the cutting room floor, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so I found that so fascinating because now we live in such a world of digital where it's like we almost have like zero excuse of not running out and making a movie because it's so much easier.
Well, the excuse to not do it is just not having a good script. Like, you know, I wish I was a writer, but I just don't find myself motivated really to write stories. And so I'd love to go out and film something, but I don't really have anything to film, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, well, Robert wasn't exactly a writer. He sort of wrote a basic script while he was a lab rat, and then they just kind of figure it out as they shot it.
At least he wrote something.
Yeah, and then it definitely worked out, and I think it speaks to him more as an editor and a cameraman as he found a lot of stuff as he was going instead of through the writing process. So he sort of wrote it as he was making it.
Right. And used what he had.
Mm-hmm. Like I found the close-ups of like the figurine China faces so funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the close-up of the dog with the sunglasses was hilarious.
That was awesome. Yeah. There was a lot of good humor to the movie. Like what Robert Rodriguez did in the movie that you don't see very often is he would like speed up a take for the sake of comedy, you know, like when the guy set up the keyboard to play his little El Mariachi band from his keyboard. And then when the guy like, you know, reaches over to pick up the phone, he sped it up and did like double speed, which is something that you never see to punctuate like a funny moment. Even in comedy movies, you never see that. No, I'm not saying like you don't see it today. You used to see it in old movies. Like, no, you basically never see that. People don't do that.
Speed wise, no.
Yeah. And like, you know, I've seen a couple of other movies by Robert Rodriguez. I've seen all the Spy Kids and stuff. And I don't even think he continued doing that in like Spy Kids, but he definitely should have, because that could have been a signature of his. I haven't seen Sin City. I haven't seen
Sin
Machete
City's
or anything.
Good.
I've heard it's good.
I think you would like it. It's such a great color film. Like I'm someone that loves color in film, and just, you know, they make it look like a comic book where they like punctuate scenes with certain colors. Like Elijah Wood, he has such big blue eyes.
Big blue.
That they color his eyes like just like big and blue. And
do you think he's famous because of those?
Yes,
those
definitely.
Yes. Yeah, I'm interested in seeing it.
I think you would love it because you love Robert Rodriguez and you love comic book stuff generally. And it's sort of a bit more gritty. I'm assuming along the lines of Watchmen.
Right.
Where it's like, this is not your mama's comic book series.
Yeah. Yeah. I got Watchmen into your hands and you're reading through it right now, prepping to watch the movie because I really want to see the movie.
Maybe that should be one of our next double features, is watching Watchmen, which I haven't seen, watching Sin City, which you haven't seen.
Sure. I'm probably not gonna read Sin City though. Or should I?
Well, I didn't read it.
You didn't read it. I don't know. I'm not gonna read it.
This is another thing where I'm reading the thing before seeing the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Which could come back to bite me because I did that with some of the Harry Potter movies and I was kind of like, well, that wasn't in the book.
Well, the thing about Watchmen, I mean, we'll get there, but Watchmen, I gather, was considered by a lot of people for a long time to be unadaptable. And to a certain point, I agree, because, you know, I noticed this. I started listening to the audiobook of Fahrenheit 451.
Oh, yeah.
And the way that the narration is done in that book, all of a sudden it dawned on me, like, if they made a film adaptation of this, it would not be the same. Mm-hmm. Because they would have to literally speak the author's narration out loud in order to properly get across what was making the book so good. And at that point, you're just doing an audiobook, so it wouldn't work as a movie, in my opinion. I never finished Fahrenheit 451, but that was the observation that I made. So for Watchmen, it contained a lot of things that people considered were things you could only do in comics, and that wasn't able to be properly translated to the screen, which is why it took so long to make a film adaptation.
Right.
So, yeah, it might bite you in the butt if you read the comic first and then watch the movie, but I think it's necessary, It's because the movie version of Watchmen is not going to give you the whole story of what you're going to get out of the comic. So it makes sense to read the comic first. Sin City, I have no idea what the comic is like. If I can find it at the library, I'll read it, because I've been getting a lot of graphic novels and manga from the library lately, which has been awesome. But if I can't, easily get my hands on a copy, I might just watch the movie, and then if it's good enough, I'll read the graphic novel. But now we're getting really off track.
Well, it's all within the same universe.
The
It
Robert
shows
Rodriguez cinematic universe.
Yeah, it all shows like the complexity of him, that he can do a gritty comic book movie where it's pretty intense, and then he can do like a family-friendly feature like Spy Kids or Shark Boy and Lava Girl.
Spy Kids is dope.
It is. So like when we saw the scene of the keyboardist, I'm like, okay, I could see where this connects with Spy Kids.
Right.
Because it was pretty goofy. And I really liked the goofy elements because I knew there was going to be maybe some comedic elements, but I didn't really know anything about the keyboardist and stuff. So I was charmed by that kind of stuff.
He kind of has that shared DNA with Sam Raimi, that like he can make a movie that's about a pretty serious topic and pretty serious and like dark things going on, but with such a weird twist of comedy to it that you can't help but smile, which I respect.
Like his peer,
Tarantino?
Yes, Quentin Tarantino. Yeah. I forgot his name at first. Except for in that one scene where the kid was holding the head, and I was like, that looks like Quentin Tarantino.
Well, it's funny you say that. My final little bit in Andy's trivia corner is apparently that severed head in the dream sequences was supposed to be Robert Rodriguez.
Oh, I can see that.
And it wasn't until I read that that I was like, oh, it does have that kind of like do-rag that Robert Rodriguez wears. So I guess, yeah, it makes sense.
Well, the part that I was reading earlier is he said, we have this head lying around. I'm assuming he had it made for like one of his short films.
They had it lying around?
Like he just had it on hand.
But didn't he drive down to Mexico to shoot it? He must have brought it with him. He can't say he just had it on hand.
He probably just brought it being like, maybe I'll use it.
I'll find a use for this severed head of mine.
Yeah, I think so. And he's like, oh, the kid's holding the basketball. I should just get him holding the head and be like, oh, I made like an artsy movie in school.
That seems like such a wasted opportunity to have him be, like Robert Rodriguez himself, be an extra in the movie who gets his head cut off. That's production value right there.
That's true. Why didn't he do that? Well, who would be filming?
Yeah.
The whole point was he was like, I'm doing everything myself.
Just put it on a tripod. Just put it on a tripod.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
When we were watching the movie, there was a scene where the mariachi like jumps onto a bus in a chase sequence.
It wasn't so much that he jumped onto a bus. It was that he was like riding down a cable using like a medieval flail to hang onto the cable with a guitar case between his knees, and then he crashed into the bus. Yeah. And that happened, and I was like, how could they have possibly gotten that on a budget this low?
Right. It looked like a Jackie Chan level thing.
Totally, yeah.
Like when we were watching Police Story, I feel like he does a somewhat similar scene where he's like hanging off of a bus.
Yeah, he did a big old bus stunt. Yeah, for sure.
Right. So the thing about this, I was saying this when we were watching it, I was like, it wasn't a stunt. Well, in a way it was.
Right.
So they had a guy make him a pulley cable that like a pulley thing that he swung from, and the guy that made it was supposed to catch him, and Robert was shooting on a ladder, I think.
Oh yeah, there's a picture of him standing on the ladder in the book.
Yeah, this is also for a part where he like comes into town and stuff.
Right.
So Robert was shooting this, and he had like a telephoto lens, and it was supposed to be that Carlos was swinging and they had someone driving the bus that was going to drive by, and it was going to look through compression that he was like connecting with the bus, but he was actually farther away than it was.
But well, my question is, how did they get the involvement of the bus? Like, they just walk up to the bus driver and be like, "Hey, can we just like use the bus for like an hour?" Like
that's basically how they did the rest of the movie, where they like went up to a
suppose.
jail and they're like, "Can we shoot in this active jail with real prisoners?" and
dope.
stuff like that. Can we use these Uzis and have you watch the scene? And they're like, "Yeah."
So you're saying?
So the bus was supposed to, you know, call Carlos, okay, go swing, and then the bus was gonna drive by and, you know, he was gonna miss the bus. But what happened was he missed his cue and the bus started driving and he actually slammed into the bus. But even he was fine. And Robert,
he was fine? How do you not have like broken ribs?
I don't know. Robert was like, got the shot. And then they like shot some stuff from different angles of him, like, you know, jumping under the hood and stuff like that. But like that shot of him on the pulley, like crashing into the bus, that wasn't a stunt. That just happened by accident.
Well, it's pretty badass.
Yeah.
Again, like Jackie Chan level.
Yeah, because like Jackie Chan, a lot of his stunts are basically not stunts.
Yeah,
it's
like
just
real
like
injuries.
Yeah, like in Police Story again, there's a part where he like goes down like an electrical thing and
it's
like a mall.
It's a pole with a bunch of like string lights attached to it.
Yeah, and he goes down and they all shut off and he like got electrocuted.
Yeah, he like burned off all the skin on his fingertips.
Yeah, and it's like that's why he's the best of all time, because it's not a stunt. It's just him doing something incredibly reckless.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, the script says I'm supposed to jump through a window. I'm gonna just do it. Roll.
Yeah. I think Tom Cruise is along the same lines where he's like, I try to do as much as I can myself.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's kind of crazy, but Police Story is like one of the best action movies I've ever seen.
Oh, for sure.
So it's
Even
definitely worth it.
Even the scene with the phones is like, it's not inherently an action scene, but all the choreography with him answering the 3 phones, that scene alone is worth watching. If you haven't seen Police Story and you don't mind foreign films, go ahead and watch it.
Yeah.
So,
well, this film that we're watching was a foreign film.
Yeah, technically, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It was Spanish.
Yeah.
Watch it with subtitles on.
Yeah. So technically, I am correct.
Yeah.
Great.
So hopefully you're a fan of foreign films.
Foreign films are great.
Yeah. I mean, what's not to like? I mean, it's great to see different film perspectives from other countries and stuff. And, you know, like, it's okay that it's in a different language. You basically get what things are going on based on body language, and then the subtitles fill it in.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of anime anyway, so I'm used to watching lots of subtitled content. If you, audience out there, have any recommendations for good foreign language films, feel free to shoot them over.
I would love to do that, like maybe a double feature sometime of different foreign films that we haven't seen.
Yeah, I'd love to watch more Korean films. I know Faraz probably has some recommendations on that. Yeah. So what would you give it out of 10, out of 5, whatever you want to rate it?
So along the lines of his wife Elizabeth is, objectively it's like a 7, but knowing how he made it, and it was basically like MacGyvered together, it was like amazing for what it was.
Right.
But still objectively like 7.
Objectively, yeah.
Because it's
A
like,
for effort.
It's also a movie, like, it was like 1993, and it's like super grainy, it has chromatic aberrations, some shots are out of focus, but it was still really cool, and they were able to film a turtle ducking into its shell
Cute
by
thing.
accident.
Yeah.
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 I mean, it was great for what it was. Like, they made a movie for like no money and had everyone volunteer and help out and do lines and stuff.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you didn't get through such an interesting book and then finally watch the movie and be like, oh, it was actually a pile of garbage.
Well, I don't think Columbia Pictures and other companies would bid for him to buy the film and then spend $1 million on post-production if it wasn't decent.
You never know. Companies spend millions of dollars on films that are utter garbage.
Yeah, that's true.
That's true. So I'm curious to show you his next film. Well, I don't know if it's his next film, but it's kind of like the sequel / sort of half remake, sort of not
Desperado.
to El Mariachi. Yeah, Desperado, which I have seen. And then the threequel, if you can call it that, Once Upon a Time in Mexico, which I have not seen, but I am interested in it. I think Johnny Depp is in it.
He is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in it because there's a specific scene that I know they do in that movie that I really want to see, and I think you would get a kick out of it too. But maybe we'll have to do like a triple feature. Robert Rodriguez, do Desperado. Oh, you want to see From Dusk Till Dawn too?
I do, and that's Quentin Tarantino.
Right. Oh, did they like co-write it and Robert Rodriguez directed it? Because Tarantino didn't direct it, eh?
No, he didn't.
Right. I think it's directed by Robert Rodriguez.
I think Tarantino wrote it.
Yeah. What do you know about it?
It's like,
this is a leading question.
I'm pretty sure it's like a vampire movie.
Okay. Where are you getting that from?
Well, it's From Dusk Till Dawn.
Okay.
It just sounds like, it sounds like Night of the Living Dead, where it's like, we have to survive the night kind of thing.
Okay. But where are you getting vampires from?
I feel like we saw some special effects sequence from that film, and it led me to believe it was about vampires.
Okay.
I think.
Interesting. Those who have seen this movie may or may not understand why I'm incessantly asking these questions. But anyway, we'll watch it at some point.
I think I'm so actually amped for spooky season, which is so crazy because I used to get so scared so easily. But I'm actually so excited. I'm like, I want to like see all these cool horror films that I haven't seen. So
yeah,
that'll be one of them, I think.
You used to not like horror films, right?
Mm-mm.
But that was because most of the horror films I gather that you've seen were probably crap horror films.
I don't know. I saw Slither, which was directed by James Gunn, who is pretty a famous director.
Yeah.
And I think it's a well-reviewed film, but I was also 11 and it's gross.
Right.
Because, well, yeah.
Yeah, so what, like me growing up, the horror movies that I was shown by people who shouldn't have been showing them to me were, you know, like Final Destination 2 and 3 and like Resident Evil 1 or whatever, or like Human Centipede, right?
Ugh.
Which is a horrible movie in more ways than one.
But things like, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street, stuff like that, that's actually good.
This is what I'm saying. It's like I grew up seeing those crappy movies and being like, oh, I hate horror movies. They're not for me. I don't like them at all. Right. But those are, I would argue, bad horror movies. They're cheap and dumb. And then it wasn't until pretty much Nightmare on Elm Street and Evil Dead 1 and 2 were the first horror movies that I saw from sort of like an older era. And I was like, these are really good. They're interesting and funny, and they have creative ideas. And then I saw, you know, like some old horror movies, like, you know, Dracula from the 30s I saw. And that had that like creepy chill of horror movies that wasn't just like jump scares and over the top like blood from killers and stuff. And then I saw The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, which in my opinion is the best horror movie ever made.
It's definitely one of them.
Just like from the scare tactics and the creature effects and just the overall plot, the pacing, the acting, the directing, the lighting, it is amazing. It is my favorite horror movie. Well, actually, Evil Dead 2 is my favorite horror movie, but The Thing is a better horror movie. Best horror movie ever made.
Well, Evil Dead 2 is a lot more cheeky.
Right. It's got more personality.
Which, yeah, again, I'm so excited for spooky season. I already have like a list of movies where I'm like, I'm so excited to watch them. But we're totally going off tangent.
Yeah. So From Dusk Till Dawn, I'm interested in rewatching that because it's been a few years. You know, Tarantino acts in it, right?
Yeah, well, he acted in Pulp Fiction, which I've seen.
Right, but in From Dusk Till Dawn, he's like a main character.
Yeah, I think he was an actor in Golden Girls episode. So like he
was he like an Elvis impersonator?
Yeah.
How did that even happen?
Well, he was, he needed money.
Doing that?
Yeah, I mean,
how do you even get that job?
I'm sure
like, hey, I'm Quentin Tarantino, okay? I really love movies, and I work in a video store, okay? And now I'm just going to play an Elvis impersonator in an episode of Golden Girls. Like, what's wrong with that,
I'm sure he's talked about it on a podcast or something.
I'd be interested in that. Actually, there's I don't know if it was like a show or a YouTube show or whatever, but there was a thing on YouTube that I saw, I think it was called The Director's Chair, where Robert Rodriguez talked with Quentin Tarantino. They did like a little interview where they talked about filmmaking. And that was, I would say, one of the biggest things where I was like, watching this, how can you not want to make films? It just looks like such a fun and creative process. Like I couldn't get over it, how much fun they made filmmaking seem. And those are two guys who love making films.
For sure. Well, leading back to this with Light and Magic, what's appealing about the process of filmmaking is, creating something out of nothing and,
right.
making it basically like magic.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's appealing. And, with Robert Rodriguez, it's like he made it all himself. I think as two creative people that are camera persons, we love the idea of making something.
Right. Do you want to jump into Light and Magic?
Yeah.
So, in case you couldn't tell, the theme of this episode is filmmaking. Mm-hmm. So, we watched the 6-part documentary about the history of industrial light and magic, sort of, titled Light and Magic. And the reason I say sort of is because I feel like there's some pretty key moments of industrial light and magic that they completely skip over.
Yeah. And one of our friends of the pod, Gabe, in his review, he called it kind of like a puff piece.
Yeah.
Which I don't disagree. I mean, obviously, they were kind of blowing up their own butt. Being like, look how great we are. We made all this cool stuff.
Yeah.
And then they're just kind of brushing over like, oh yeah, the guy that was like the head of the production team for Star Wars that won an Oscar, we're just gonna let him go and move to San Francisco.
Yeah. So overall, I did really like it.
Yeah.
This is gonna be one of those things where like I liked it so much that I'm gonna be nitpicking, and so it's gonna sound like I didn't like it because I'm gonna be mostly bringing up negative things. But overall, loved it. From the moment I saw the trailer, I was like, I am hyped through the roof for this. Because I love movies that Industrial Light and Magic have done. Obviously, like Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Back to the Future, Roger Rabbit, which we just watched. So
they didn't talk about that at all, though.
Well, that was one of my main complaints.
Yeah.
Especially because they showed clips from it in the opening sequence, which, by the way, not a show that really needed an opening sequence. No. Could have cut that from like every episode. But I digress. So I was hyped, really excited. And the main things that I wanted to see was like the really nuts and bolts of how they did certain things. And I got that. They talked about like the motion control systems that they made and how they were really like, DIY, and the different tactics that they used, like putting the panels for the Death Star outside in the parking lot and just using like basically sunlight to light all the shots, and like
that was so cool.
Running the camera on a truck. That stuff I found so interesting. I loved that they highlighted, the very specific people who had really, key roles in some of those films,
like Dennis,
and yeah, like they really weren't just like, oh, it was all George Lucas all the way, Lucas this, George Lucas that. They did do that, but they were also like, hey, this guy and these guys played key roles, and John Dykstra and all that. So I thought that was awesome. My complaints were, it was a 6-part documentary. It really should have been like 12 parts. Because basically what they did was they were like, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars, little bit of this, little bit of that, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars. Completely ignore the sequel trilogy, which I was okay with and I thought was hilarious.
No, they talked about it a little.
No, they didn't. Name one time.
He definitely mentioned it.
When?
When the guy, I want to say his name was John Kroll.
You're wrong.
He was the head of production design on that. And they talked about how they were like shooting in a hallway that was like a chapel, and George Lucas didn't like the light fixture, so they were gonna take it out. And they talked about how for that film, because they had made digital editing, that they were able to take different takes of the sequence. Like, they showed a shot of Qui-Gon Jinn, and they showed how they use, like, different takes for different people to get the best performance and pieced it together.
Sequel trilogy.
Oh, the new one.
Yeah.
I thought you meant, like, the sequel as in the second.
No,
like,
the prequel trilogy is 1 to 3. The sequel trilogy is 7, 8, 9.
Okay, fair enough.
Completely ignored
No, they
it.
didn't.
They
talk
skipped
about
it 100% and just went to Mandalorian.
Because the special effects on Mandalorian are like, you know, industry changing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it makes sense that they just skipped right to that because it's the important part.
I was more than fine with them skipping the sequel trilogy, and I thought it was actually really funny that they did it so blatantly. Yeah. Not even a word. One clip. I remember seeing like one clip, but not a single word about the sequel trilogy, which was funny. But the thing that pained me the most was just the fact that they skipped over so many films like Back to the Future and Roger Rabbit.
So true.
And, you know, they talked a little bit about Poltergeist, a little bit about Raiders of the Lost Ark, but
not much.
Not the other Indiana Jones movies, you know?
That's true.
And not so many other things like brief touches on Forrest Gump and stuff, but like honestly, you could have added a whole nother 6 episodes and told the story more fully. And I would have ate it up, you know? Mm-hmm. Like the Beatles Get Back was only 3 parts, right? 3 or 4 parts. But it totaled.
No, I think it was.
What?
It was like, I mean, it totaled like 7 hours.
Yeah,
maybe
I think it was 3 episodes that were like 2 hours plus each.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So like 7, 8 hours. And that was about like 30 days in the Beatles' lives.
Well, they filmed like everything.
Right. But Light and Magic goes over like 45 years. And to do that in 6 episodes and to do all those projects justice, I really didn't think it was possible.
Well, that lends to the criticism of it maybe being a puff piece. It's like they're only showing their best of the best effects, like T2 and stuff, and more like some of the groundbreaking stuff, like Jurassic Park, where it was like basically overnight, people stopped wanting to use models and like got on the CGI train.
Right. I also, you know, I was really glad that they talked about Terminator 2.
Mm-hmm.
But another small complaint, and I would say this is more so about the trailer than anything, is that the trailer was really trying to hype up Industrial Light and Magic as a company, you know? And they were like, yeah, they were responsible for, you know, non-linear editing with Editroid, and they made this, which became Photoshop, and they did this, which became Pixar. But they're kind of like fudging it a bit, because Editroid was, you know, kind of from the mind and heart of George Lucas. He wanted nonlinear editing, but it really didn't have that much to do with Industrial Light and Magic. Photoshop was made by a guy who went on to work at Industrial Light and Magic, but it wasn't made at Industrial Light and Magic. It didn't have anything to do with it. It was made with his brother. And then Pixar was a computer used to make visual effects. But Industrial Light and Magic didn't make like Toy Story or Incredibles or whatever. That only happened after they sold the company. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of misleading the way that they tried to advertise that. Like, oh, Industrial Light and Magic was the birthplace of everything you know and love. It's like, well, sort of, but not really.
They were still revolutionary. And
absolutely.
It set things in motion. It's like, without them making the Pixar computer and selling it to Apple, we wouldn't have had Toy Story. And because of the Pixar computer, John Kroll and his brother got inspired to make Photoshop based on their demo of seeing the Pixar computer.
Right. But it wasn't like Industrial Light and Magic produced Photoshop.
No. But, I mean, it's... he ended up working there, yeah. And
I know. It's just nitpicks, like I said.
I mean, nonlinear editing definitely is like
game changing.
Completely. And I mean, just everything. Like they definitely revolutionized special effects in general, because like they said, there was like no special effects house before.
Right.
And they like basically built that the ground up. And then same with CGI is like they trained some of their model people and then like a handful of computer people that actually knew how to do it and like built it from the ground up. Like no one was making that and they're like, all right, let's make this dino move. And like
yeah, I did find the switch from analog filmmaking to digital so interesting and validating, because especially me, I'm somebody who uses digital filmmaking and non-linear editing every single day, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It would be so monotonous and inconvenient to do it that way. It's so easy the way that it's done now. The barrier to entry is so small. And it just puts into perspective George Lucas in like the 80s being like, no, I just really hate doing it this way. And, you know, I wish there was a better way. We got to set in motion, you know, like we got to start working on the technology now.
I love that.
And then once you know, that technology came about, him and his peers were like, I'm not doing it any other way, because the way that it was done before sucked. And now it's way, 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 way easier and cheaper. Meanwhile, going back to Quentin Tarantino, you have people like Quentin Tarantino who are like, oh, it's just the look of film is it's just like better, you know, like it's just it looks so much better, you know, and I just love film. And I'm like, you know,
like I disagree.
I really disagree, you know, especially because one of the biggest characteristics of film stock, in my opinion, is film grain. And people go nuts over film grain, and I can't stand it.
I can't stand it either.
We saw The Exorcist at the Mayfair, and the amount of film grain in that film was completely distracting.
And it was like, I think it wasn't an indie film, right?
No.
Like, so then they had the means to light it better, to not have...
Something like El Mariachi, it's like, oh, it's grainy because it was like low budget and a young filmmaker, and I don't know, maybe he bought cheap film stock or whatever.
No, the way it worked back then was the same as ISO. It's you bought the film stock for, you know, it had to be grainy because he was bringing in artificial light because he was shooting in low light locations.
Right. Well, some of the daytime shots were also grainy. Like the first scene was daytime and it was really grainy.
Well, back then, I mean, maybe I'm not speaking properly, but to my knowledge is back then, just the light sensors and cameras just weren't as good as picking up things. Whereas the digital dynamic range is better, that things look less grainy to certain points.
Well, I'm pretty sure film cameras don't have sensors. It's really just like the film stock itself.
Could be.
I really don't know much about analog film and film stock, but what my understanding is that you buy film stock with a certain ISO.
Yes.
So like you're like, I'm going to be shooting in a dark location. I'm going to buy the stock that has this sensitivity or whatever.
Yes.
So my thought is maybe he was just using the wrong one at the wrong time.
That's a possibility. Or, you know, because he said that he didn't buy all of his film at once. He bought it a couple rolls at a time. It's possible he used a high ISO film stock because that's all he had.
Right. So going back to what I was saying, you know, we saw The Exorcist and the amount of film grain was just staggering.
It was terrible.
My thought is like, you're capturing something on film the way, you know, because a lot of people will make the case for film grain and be like, oh, like it's supposed to be there, right? But if you're capturing something that's in front of the camera, the film grain isn't in front of the camera. The film grain is a byproduct of the film stock. It's not supposed to be there. It's just something that happens. So I much prefer the nice clean image of a properly exposed, properly grain-free digital image than film stock that's just full of grain.
Well, you know what's funny is film professors were always saying in school, like, oh, film grain is so good. Like, digital grain doesn't even compare. Like, it just doesn't have the right look. And it's like, I do photography for a living, and sometimes I have to shoot high ISO because I'm in a low light situation. And let me tell you, digital film grain looks exactly the same as film grain.
I disagree.
Oh, you disagree, do you?
Yeah. I think if you're going to compare digital grain to film grain, like analog film grain looks better because it's like a random pattern and it looks a little more natural. Whereas, you know, a grainy image with a high ISO in digital filmmaking looks more like static. It looks more unnatural. It's It's a little more, robotic. But I don't like either.
I don't like either.
I find them both really distracting.
I don't think that film grain looks natural at all.
No.
It looks grainy.
But that's just me. My eye doesn't see film grain, so I don't want to see film grain.
That's fair.
What were we talking about?
Who knows? We've gone off on such a tangent.
Light and Magic.
Oh, well, Quentin Tarantino was saying, I like the way it was because I was a hipster.
Yeah.
Whereas, a lot of people, like Robert Rodriguez in his book that was written in the 90s was like, I cannot wait to switch to nonlinear editing because I hate doing it this way. It's so frustrating.
And you know what to me is the ultimate irony of Quentin Tarantino is he's a big proponent of like film stock and showing films in theaters in like large format and looking like really nice and crisp and whatever. But he also like probably saw the vast majority of films in his life on VHS. So it's like, if you can watch a movie in that format and get enjoyment out of it, there's no reason to be knocking digital and being like, oh, it just doesn't look right. Because like you're going to enjoy a movie no matter what it looks like if the movie itself is good. If you showed me Back to the Future on a VHS, which may in fact have been how I first watched it, I'm going to be like, that's a great movie. I'm not going to be like, oh, you know what? It's a crap movie because it's 4:3 and, the exposure looks weird because of the transfer to VHS. It's like, no, it's a good movie. It's going to give me a good experience.
Agreed.
So I find it so unnecessary to be knocking digital and knocking that process and saying that film is king. Like, what are you getting out of that? What are you getting out of that?
It's transferred to digital anyways because almost all cinemas are digital.
Exactly.
These days.
Whatever.
There's just so much flexibility. Like one of the best modern cinematographers of our time, Roger Deakins, he had this interview with Quentin Tarantino where Quentin was like, yeah, I just like film better. And Roger's like, it's just so much easier to check like what we're doing as we're doing it instead of having to like wait until dailies get back and like cross my fingers that it looks good.
Perfect example. Mad Men was shot on film. And Mad Men overall looks good. But I can't say that it looks, better than Better Call Saul. I think Breaking Bad was also shot on film, but Better Call Saul was shot on digital. Can't tell. They look pretty much the same to me.
There's so many good modern films that were shot digitally, and I don't think it takes anything away.
Right.
It's just a different choice of medium.
So Mad Men, if you go and rewatch Mad Men, there's a couple of shots where I don't know what happens, but they totally blow it. There'll be shots where like they'll cut to Don and it looks fine, and then they'll cut to Roger and it looks fine. Then they cut back to Don and it's like crazy grainy, and like they obviously mucked up some camera setting that makes it look like total garbage, and it just looks absolutely grainy and horrible. And that happens multiple times throughout season 1 of Mad Men. You can tell that like whoever they got on the camera crew hadn't, I guess, gotten it all figured out yet, because this didn't tend to happen in later seasons. But that's exactly what I mean, is if that happened on a digital camera and somehow they flicked a setting and got the shot exposed incorrectly or on the wrong setting, they'd be able to see it right away and they'd be like, oops, we mucked that up, let's do it again. Whereas Mad Men being shot on film, they got the shot, couldn't look at it, and then went to dailies or editing or whatever, and I guess they couldn't redo it, and now it's like 10 years later and we're watching it and we're like, wow, that shot looks like crap. Good job.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm assuming in the later seasons, because Mad Men became such a hit, is they probably had more of a budget to do reshoots when mistakes like that happened.
That's very possible, yeah.
That's what I'm assuming.
So back to Light and Magic itself. What did you think overall? Were you happy with it? Were you disappointed? Would you watch a second season?
I would watch a second season if I felt like it needed it. Like,
right.
If they had more interesting stuff to talk about or different interviews with different people.
Well, that was exactly kind of why I had this complaint, which is that Roger Rabbit, I think, would probably be one of the most interesting stories to tell of all the movies that Industrial Light and Magic worked on, because it's that fusing of all those layers of animation cells with the practical effects done on set that most people might not have even realized were practical effects, you know? Scenes where Roger is being dunked in and out of the sink and he spits water out. They had to design like a spigot that would come out of the sink and spit water that would represent his mouth. And then they drew animation over it, basically, or like little rigs to hold a cigar and wave it around with a little robot arm.
Right.
You know, Captain Christian on YouTube has a great video about it. We mentioned it in our Roger Rabbit episode.
Right.
Definitely go and watch that. But I would love to see a whole episode of Light and Magic about that, you know, and more emphasis put on the different Back to the Future movies where I know they, you know, use scenes from the first movie.
That's true.
With scenes from the second movie. I know they reshot them, but like, you know, Marty being on screen at the same time, there could be interesting stuff there, making the DeLorean fly. I'd love to hear about that kind of stuff.
For sure.
And I don't know if it's like too little too late for them to do a season 2 because it would be like Haruhi Suzumiya season 2 where it's like, oh yeah, season 2 takes place halfway through in the middle of season 1, you know, like, I don't know, it might just be too confusing, but we're big fans of the movies that made us, which have individual episodes that focus on different movies. And there was a lot of shared personnel in movies that made us and Light and Magic because there was that whole Jurassic Park episode that involved a lot of the same people. So there were some
told that similar stories.
Yeah,
too.
there were some familiar suspects that showed up. So if they're not going to do a second season of Light and Magic, I would at least love them to do a Movies That Made Us episode on Roger Rabbit.
Agreed. I think it might be better, actually.
Yeah. A lot of people aren't into Movies That Made Us or the Toys That Made Us because they find the style off-putting or like the narrator annoying or whatever, but I find it hilarious.
I think it's fun. You know, they made me like laugh so much the way that they chose to edit it. It was like, it felt like it was just for the fans or like it was just for the editor to make himself chuckle.
They are such creative documentary filmmakers on that show. I would love to get a peek behind the curtain and see how they make it or get some kind of small role on their staff. Yeah, like I absolutely love it. Every time a new season of either of those shows come out, we just pounce on it and binge it like immediately. Yeah. It's one of those shows that I could rewatch infinitely.
Definitely.
And so if you like Movies That Made Us, you'll probably like Light and Magic. If you liked Light and Magic, you might like Movies That Made Us. I highly recommend it. And Toys That Made Us.
Agreed.
Hidden gem on Netflix.
What I really liked about the ILM documentary was some of the key figures. When they introduced them, they talked about their background in film and filmmaking prior to working at ILM, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
Where it's like, you know, basically before they did that, they've always had that in them. Yeah. Where they were making, you know, like their own effects at home and, you know, like Robert Rodriguez, just working with the tools that they had with them.
Some of the stuff that they showed, like the stuff by Ken, I don't quite remember his last name, but the short films by him and some of the other guys,
Dennis,
I was like, dang, they were like teenagers when they did this. How did they do that?
Exactly.
That's crazy.
It's like, it makes sense A to B. It's like, those are the game changers.
Yeah. Speaking of which, back to Robert Rodriguez, I know he mentioned his short film Bedhead in Rebel Without a Crew. Have you seen that?
No.
It's on YouTube. We should watch it after this.
We should, because I think it stars his sister, right?
Yeah, it does. It's legitimately good.
Well, it won like a ton of festivals.
Yeah. It's because watching Bedhead, if you watch that, if you picture that being submitted by like somebody who was in our graduating class in BRTF, if they had submitted that, you would have been like, damn, this person's talented.
Yeah, well, he wasn't even doing it for a school project. He was just doing that for fun and entering it into festivals.
There you go.
And then he, like, I'm pretty sure he dropped out of school after that, after making El Mariachi, because he made it on, like, summer vacation before I think he even did a filmmaking class.
I think might have been between like year 1 and 2, but
because, well, he talked about how he had to, it's weird in American schools, is you have to do a bunch of prerequisites and then you have to apply to get into a major program. So he was trying to get into the film program, but he had low grades or something, but they're like, you know, please let me in. And I think he showed them Bedhead and he's like, all right, you can go in.
Oh, right. Okay,
something like that.
Yeah.
So it's like, he wasn't even really like a film student. He was just like taught all by himself and just self-propelled.
Right.
It's like that shows like the geniuses to the non-geniuses. It's like he didn't need to be told any of this stuff. He just went out and did it.
Yeah. You can tell as filmmakers, people who come from a filmmaking background in media, we're very passionate about this. That's kind of like half the reason we're doing a podcast. So I would actually love to cover more content on the podcast that is about filmmaking and involves filmmaking.
For sure.
Maybe we'll cover The Room at some point, even though we've seen, at least I've seen The Room so many times. You've seen it at least twice. I know we've met Greg Sestero.
Oh yeah. That was amazing.
Disaster Artist is one of my favorite books for sure. Yeah. I remember when you met him, you can corroborate this, but when you met him, you were like, hey, can you sign my book? This is one of my favorite books. And he was like, really? Why?
Well, he was being his own critic.
Yeah.
But to me, it just showed like a passion for a young person wanting so bad to be creative and feeling gatekeeped. And just like really wanting to do something and to be successful. And I read it in film school where I was doing the same thing, where I was a creative person wanting to make stuff, but not knowing how to get started.
Right.
And it just felt like such a great way. It was about making a movie, but it was so much more than that. It was about like a coming of age story for him, like coming into his own through making the film.
Yeah, and the friendship between Greg and Tommy. Like, the structure of the book is so excellent because it bounces back and forth between Tommy and Greg's burgeoning friendship and them meeting and sort of the idea slowly over years forming to make The Room. Mm-hmm. Bouncing between that and then the actual production of The Room. It's done so well that it's...
That's also another thing. People make fun of Tommy Wiseau, but he was like, you know what? I'm being gatekept. Gatekept. I don't think anyone ever uses it in the past tense. Yeah. You know what? People are not letting me in because they think I'm a weirdo or whatever. So, screw all these people. I'm making my own movie. And it's like, it was a bad movie, but it's super famous.
Yeah, like
people watch it.
Him and Robert Rodriguez did the same thing. They were like, I'm just gonna grab the bull by the horns and use what money I have and make what I can, and that's respectable.
The difference is Robert Rodriguez was already a filmmaker prior and had some skill and knowledge on the subject,
whereas Tommy Wiseau sold leather jackets and pants
and threw caution to the wind and didn't go about things in the right way and was ego trippy. But that's what made the book and the movie so fascinating is how far he fell through
how far he fell?
Like making all the wrong choices.
Right.
Whereas Robert, he's like, I don't have much money, but I kind of know what I'm doing, so I'm going to try my best to make it good.
Right. It just goes to show you that you just got to get out there and make stuff, because even if you don't end up being like the next Robert Rodriguez, all those guys at Industrial Light and Magic made those short films as teenagers or whatever that got them probably their first job making like commercial special effects, which got them, landed them at Industrial Light and Magic working on effects of these films. And then, I know at least one of them went from working on those effects to directing those films.
That's true,
because George Lucas just believed in him so much. He's like, oh, you want to quit ILM? How about instead, you don't quit and I just pay for you to go to film school?
It's like, how could you say no to that?
Yeah. Amazing.
One of the, director that's won like at least 2 Oscars at that point.
Yeah.
It's like, he believes in me. He gave me this job in the first place. I kind of have to take it.
Right. Wait, you're saying George Lucas won at least 2 Oscars at that point?
Yeah, for I want to say American Graffiti and Star Wars.
No.
What?
His films won effects Oscars, but George Lucas never won an Oscar. And it's funny actually because there's a clip on YouTube of, I think it's like Charlie Rose interviewing George Lucas, and Charlie Rose is like, you've had a great career, you've got Oscars, and George Lucas is like,
no.
And Charlie Rose is like,
no Oscar.
George Lucas is like,
no Oscar.
And Charlie Rose just looks like dumbfounded.
That's so surprising.
Obviously, he didn't do his research before interviewing the friggin' guy.
Well, I assumed because, I want to say American Graffiti and Star Wars and probably other ones are on the AFI 100 list.
Right.
And it's like those are considered two of the greatest films of all time by the American Film Institute. And they didn't win an Oscar. But I mean...
The Oscars are a joke.
The Academy has never been very... They usually don't pick what's going to be lasting. I mean, obviously there's exceptions to the rule, such as Godfather, etc. But sometimes they pick real stinkers that do not last the test of time.
As far as I'm concerned, the Oscars mean nothing.
Basically.
The Oscars are entertaining as an award show, but the awards themselves, I don't think, hold any value.
Because so many people have got robbed over the years.
Yeah. There's so many, talented actors or actresses or filmmakers or effects people, sound design people, production designers who haven't won anything. Cinematographers too. Sure. Roger Deakins took him ages to win an Oscar. It's like, do people have their eyes open?
Yeah, I don't know if Dean Cudney, I might not be saying his name correctly. He did a lot of ILM films, including Jurassic Park.
Right.
And he is an amazing cinematographer. And I don't think he's won any Oscars. I could totally be wrong.
Did you say he did The Thing as well?
He did.
Right.
And that's some of the best
lighting in that movie.
Exactly. And Jurassic Park has great lighting too.
Right. Do you have a rating for ILM?
I found the content enjoyable and I found it heartwarming, inspiring as a camera person to just feel creative.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the history of the company and stuff, there's maybe some elements being left out. The way that they told it was maybe a little dry at times, but it was interesting for sure.
Great rating.
Well, I'm building up to that.
Uh-huh.
So I liked that they came full circle with The Mandalorian. So it's like we started with practicals and then it was like CG only. And then it's like we're slowly kind of making our way to a hybrid where it's like there's some practical and we're using elements of practical on-set CG using the LED panels to film it live.
Yeah.
It's so cool. I'm so excited. I really hope it becomes like more of a lower industry standard being able to commercially available buy LED panels where you can change out the lighting and stuff. That'd be so cool.
I remarked to you that I think one of the best things that you can get out of that is letting actors be able to act in front of a virtual environment that's not a green screen.
Agreed.
Where you don't have Pedro Pascal looking off into a wall of green and having to pretend it's a sunset. You can have him actually looking at a sunset and react to it. Not that you'll see very much because he has a helmet on, bad example, but you get what I'm saying, right? They can react truly in character to what's around them instead of Michael Jordan Space Jam style and have to look at a blue screen or green screen and be like, I see the basketball hoop. There it is right there.
He did an amazing job considering.
All things considered, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, it also lends to the ambientness. It's like if he's standing in front of an LED panel of a sunset, he's going to have all the light leak on his face and stuff.
Yeah,
so it's just so much easier cinematography wise. And like they said, they're moving what normally would have been post-production to pre-production.
Exactly.
So
interesting.
That was so cool to see an inside look on that and seeing a little bit about that. But in terms of the show as a whole and my enjoyment watching it, maybe a 7.5.
7.5. You gave a 7.5 last time, which is if you're going to give halves, it's got to be in the 5-star system, not the 10-star system.
I don't know.
Because if you're giving halves in the 10-star system, then when you defractionalize
you're right. Okay.
or whatever, then you're rating out of 20.
Mm.
So what was that?
Maybe
14.5 out of 20? No, 15 out of 20.
I don't know. Okay.
1 out of 1.
Because I think it's a bit better than average, but I don't know if he was my ultimate favorite. I feel like 8 is an A. And it's is it an A? Maybe.
I would give it an 8, but maybe if there's no season 2, I might drop it to a 7.
Just because, you want to see that Roger Rabbit. But I did find all the stuff about the Abyss and T2 and all that stuff that I didn't know about.
That was excellent.
Really interesting.
Because
cool.
I already loved Terminator 2. It's one of my favorite movies. One of the best action movies ever made. One of the best sequels ever made.
Up.
But even I didn't have the full appreciation of what went into the effects in that movie. And now I just love it even more.
It was pretty hardcore. And because it's like all robots and crazy stuff like that, it didn't need to look real, which is why Jurassic Park was such a step in a crazy direction, is they were trying to make things look lifelike. Whereas with T2, I was like, it doesn't need to look super lifelike.
Right on. So, for what the future holds for us, we already kind of mentioned, we're looking at Watchmen next. You're, a couple chapters, couple volumes into the Watchmen graphic novel. Mm. We're looking at maybe Desperado, Once Upon a Time in Mexico to watch, to continue on with our Robert Rodriguez director study.
Director study. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, exactly. And then I just finished, or I'm maybe 15 minutes away from finishing the audiobook of a particular actor who I haven't decided if we're going to watch that actor's the early films that I haven't seen and talk about it on the podcast. But if I do, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it and discuss the baggage that comes along with that decision. Because
I'm down.
Like Frances McDormand once said,
I've got some things to say.
Oh. And as she once said, what I will have to say is before we do that, I talked about this, that I'm excited for spooky season, and I already have like some things that I'm like, oh, I want to watch that.
Right, because we're about to hit early September now.
Right.
So
it's like fall-ish.
By the time... Yeah, that's a good point, actually. By the time you're hearing this, it might be spooky season. It's not spooky season when we were recording this, but maybe by the next episode, we should be watching something.
It'll be spooky season for us.
Yeah.
Suspiria is on my list.
Suspiria.
I think it's like an older film. I want to say it's Brian De Palma, but maybe it's not. No,
I think confusing it with the Shia LaBeouf movie?
I think it's really old. No,
Disturbia.
Yes, you are. Suspiria is really old. Dream Warriors, Freddy Krueger movie.
What's wrong with what did I say?
Disturbia.
Disturbia, yeah. Shia LaBeouf?
No.
Dream
Warrior. Dream Warrior.
Like Nightmare on Elm Street. Was that 3?
Yes.
3, really?
It might be like 8 or something. I don't actually know.
Why Dream Warriors?
I heard it's one of the best ones. Is that the one we watched a review of it? You
thinking about New Nightmare?
New Nightmare.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare? Yes. That I really want to watch. I'm really interested in that.
But I also heard Dream Warriors is good.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, for the audience, for your sake, New Nightmare, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is about, it's like a continuation of Nightmare on Elm Street, but in like real life, sort of. Mm-hmm. So Heather Langenkamp played Nancy in the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, and then New Nightmare is about the actress having played that role, and now Freddy Krueger is like coming into real life, and Wes Craven like appears as Wes Craven having directed that movie, and Robert Englund is in it as Freddy, like real terror Freddy, but also as Robert Englund having played the character Freddy. So it's like such a meta experience, and I really love the original Nightmare on Elm Street, so I'm really interested in it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, well, it showed that they were just like, we're just going to continue writing these until someone tells us to stop. Because they're like, what should we do now? Let's do a movie about the movie.
I love that.
No, it's cool. Yeah. I'm excited. There's different options, but I'm excited to, look at lists and figure out, okay, like what's some of the best horror films of all time. Watch a couple. I mentioned Invaders of the Body Snatchers. Invasion, right?
Invaders of the Invaders.
Body Invaders and the Invaders.
Yeah.
Maybe The Blob.
Mm-hmm.
So we can maybe watch some creature feature things. I'm also interested in going to the theater There's a film house near us that shows older films.
Yeah, they usually play pretty good stuff around Halloween.
Yeah, so I'm maybe interested to go to one or two of those. So I'm really excited.
Yeah. Who knows what the future will hold? But yeah, this is our episode 10 anniversary. We made it to 10. High five.
High five.
All right. Well, we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye now.